Director of the Wilmington Memorial Library. I'd like to welcome you all to our annual local history program. Every year for I guess the past 7 years, we've been doing a program on Wilmington's local history. We try to take different aspects of Wilmington's history and to focus on. For example, last year we did the history of the Wilmington churches and houses of worship. 1 year we did famous Wilmington families. And every year we also try to videotape these programs so they can be broadcast at a future date on WCTV. So I'd like to thank Jim Durkee, who's here this evening, to videotape Working in Wilmington, which is the theme of our program this evening. We have copies of the other videotapes from other years, which I encourage you, if you missed any of those programs, to borrow. They're right behind Jim. We have one of the Bond family and the famous Wilmington families, and the one on the church histories, which we did last year. So very interesting if you're interested in local history to borrow one of those videos. I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Library, and you'll be able to enjoy some of the treats this evening made with cranberries and apples in honor of Wilmington's early agricultural economy. And so please, when our speakers are finished, hold your questions to the end of their presentation, and then you can ask them questions, and also share some of the memories and anecdotes that you may have about anything that they've said to add to the program's content. As I said earlier, the theme this year is Working in Wilmington, and we have Carolyn Harris, the chairman of the Historical Commission, Kathleen Black-Reynolds, town curator, and Terry McDermott, also a member of the Wilmington Historical Commission. Carolyn is going to begin by giving a presentation of Wilmington's early economy, which was basically farming, and Kathleen's going to pick up the next era, which is going to go into some of the small businesses in town. So I had to talk to this again. I was going in the order the way you were saying. You confused me. I'm sorry. Kathleen is going to go first, and then Carolyn, and then Terry. And Terry is going to bring it up to the period of the Harriman Tannery. So, Kathleen Black-Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. I know we have some stiff competition with the World Series being played, but I understand it's raining out in St. Louis, so hopefully we'll get some dwellers coming in here. Great subject matter, something that hasn't been done before, and it's going to span a time of about 300 years, which I think you'll find very interesting. So for an experiment, I would like you to close your eyes for a few minutes. I need to get you in the realm. I need to bring you down to where you need to be at this point in time. So take a few seconds and just try to suspend all your images of modern day Wilmington. Get rid of the traffic, get rid of the homes, get rid of the street lights, all of those things. And try to imagine Wilmington in its most pristine condition. Forested meadows, bubbling brooks, fresh water. Try to bring yourself right into that space. And when you're there, you may open your eyes. And if you don't open them, I'm going to assume you've fallen asleep. Okay, so here we are at 1640, much earlier than the establishment of Wilmington as a community. Wilmington was originally a part of Charlestown Village and also Woburn. Charlestown Village was huge. Thousands of acres encompassed Charlestown Village from Boston, north, west, and east. Woburn seceded, if you will, from Charlestown by permission in 1642. And as it continued to grow and develop, it started to expand its horizons, and it encouraged its settlers to move forward and outward. And so what it did, and I found this really interesting, this was sort of a gift to certain entrepreneurial men who were willing to take the challenge of being given a parcel of land, and they had to sustain that property for about 7 years. They had to work that land, they had to produce from it, and once they did that, if they could establish themselves for 7 years, it was granted to them, full title. So they didn't have to pay anything for the parcel, they could just be given it. But they had to produce from it, and it wasn't easy. They had to do a lot of things. And one of those early settlers was Will Butter, and you'll probably recognize that name. He settled what we now know as Butter's Row, Chestnut Street, Mill Road, that area. The house still stands, the house that he built in, I want to say 1665. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I think that's when it was built. So he came about 1665, and there were other settlers who came through other parts of Wilmington are also Charlestown Village. So we have the Butts over near Woburn Street, Wildwood Street. We have the Harndens throughout. We have the Eames throughout. We have, there's another family whose name has escaped me, but we have pockets of settlers coming in, and these are new settlers, and they take 7 years to establish themselves. And what they do is they clear their forested land, they cut down trees, they transport the lumber to the Mystic River shipyards, who then ship it off to England. So they make some money very early on. They build a log cabin from these logs, so now they have shelter. They plant crops in the spring. They return to their original home, bring their family back. The families harvest the crops. They plant more crops. So now 2 or 3 years have gone by. Now they raise a barn. So now they have a barn, they have a place to put their animals. So they bring cattle into their property. And then, within the 7-year period, they build themselves a farmhouse. And it's at this point where their settlement is done. They are settled. They are now old settlers. And part of the charge that was given to them when they were first given the land was this. It was actually written as such: to encourage agricultural pursuits and thus be better able to induce settlers of like faith and courage to establish here a home for themselves and children. In addition, they were to subdue the howling wilderness and to plant and uphold the principles of the heroic little colony. I find that very patriotic, very spiritual, and I certainly would have tried to do this. I would have become one of these pioneers. I think it's a great charge. The Butters settled the boggy meadow end of Wilmington. We have some nicknames in Wilmington. That's one of them. We have the land of Nod, which is North Wilmington. We have the land of Goshen, which is also that same area. There was also a portion called Lebanon, which was a cedar swamp. But Wilmington, would not be. Wilmington was a typical farm area in most respects. Most farms were between 80 and 100 acres. Large portions were used for livestock and to grow hay. About 10 acres were for your regular crops, your potatoes and your wheat and things like that. Then you had your big woodlot, which was constantly used, cut down, reforested, and the remainder was used for a kitchen garden. And some of you have these at home. These are your gardens that you can just walk out your back door and go to and grab your beans and your peas and your pumpkins and your herbs if you have them. And those, of course, were used by the women and the girls on the farm who cooked and did the storing of the foods and the preparing of them for the winter. But these pockets of family farms existed throughout all of Wilmington, and it wasn't yet established. But they helped contribute to the evolution of the community. So as such, they decided, as the pockets grew bigger, because, think about it, you had to bring some really strong men with you. So you had to have, sisters that married into good, strong families, so that their brothers-in-laws could come with them and help them settle their farms. So these pockets are developing, and about 1728, these families got together and they decided to petition Woburn to separate. So now Wilmington wants to create its own self-image. It does no longer want to be part of Woburn, and they do that because, in their words, it was too hard to travel to the meeting house to worship on Sabbath. And it took about 2 years for that argument to be granted, and soon enough, Wilmington was established. 1730 is when Wilmington was granted its own little community. And in 1732, we had a meeting house that was built, and that is where obviously people went to worship, and it was where town government was established. So now you have these pockets of farms coming right here to the center of town in Wilmington. So Wilmington is, here we are, 1730, nicely established. Farming in general included all the, your basic crops, your carrots, your potatoes, your corn, your grains, things like that. And these were grown generally for family consumption and also for market and also for the livestock on the property. But what's unique to Wilmington are 3 crops in particular. And of course, you all know the first one would be the apple, the Baldwin apple. This is world-renowned. And Wilmington's the only community to have erected a monument in honor of a fruit. And I don't mean just the community in Wilmington, Massachusetts, I mean in the world. There was actually a photograph of the Baldwin Apple Monument sent to the 1901 Paris World Fair for that claim. It was the only monument ever erected in honor of fruit. I think that's amazing. That's pretty unique. The apple tree was found on the Butters farm. It was propagated by Naomi Baldwin, and every farm in Wilmington had an apple orchard. Probably every farm everywhere had an apple orchard. It's just a hardy fruit, and it was easy to grow. There's been some question about the destruction of the original tree. Some say it never existed. Some resources say it was transplanted in another community. I think that's just a rivalry thing. Somebody else said it got struck by lightning, and some say it got blown over by a gale of 1815. And I don't know anything more about this gale of 1850, but it must have been a pretty big wind that year. Apple Tuesday was established, and it happened to fall on the third Tuesday of October. We missed it by a week, but I figured with all the leap years between then and now, we've caught up. Another crop unique to Wilmington are hops. Hops were basically found in Wilmington. They weren't purposely grown here. And a friend of mine told me this saying about Wilmington, and I remembered it because I think it's so true. She told me, if you're in Wilmington and you dig a hole and you're not in water, you're not in Wilmington. And I believe that. It's true. So hops need this kind of soil. They need a wet soil, they need a sandy soil, they need an acidic soil to grow. And boy, Wilmington didn't let this one go at all. You know, for 100 years, they grew this crop. We were known as Hop Town. In fact, in all of Middlesex County, Wilmington was the #1 producer of hops. We beat out Tewksbury, we beat out Billerica. There were numbers in the millions for 1 year of production. Like over $2 million worth of hops were produced in 1 year in the middle of the 19th century. And Massachusetts, because of this large demand and supply, they enacted a law in 1806 that demanded that hops be inspected for cleanliness and quality. And our own William Blanchard was elected to serve as the inspector. And he made, in that year that he was elected or appointed, $2,000 at that point in time. And that was as much as the governor of Massachusetts made in the same year. So it's a very important post that he held. And the third crop I wanted to give Wilmington credit for are cranberries. So I'm delighted that we have some cranberry sweets here tonight. Again, cranberries need that wet, sandy soil. They were discovered here in Wilmington. We didn't bring them into Wilmington. But in doing my research on cranberries in particular, I contacted Cape Cod, Pennsylvania Resources, Mass Horticultural, and they didn't have any information on Wilmington's cranberries. But again, the numbers that I have found in our sources here, they go over the millions of dollars in production. So there was quite a crop here in Wilmington. Cranberries are one of 3 fruits that are native to North America. Cranberries is one, the Concord grape the other, and the blueberry the next. Native Americans used cranberries for dye. They used them for flavoring their foods, like their deer meat, which I'm sure tasted nice. I can imagine nice cranberry stuffing with my deer. But they also used them for medicinal purposes, for those everyday common arrowhead wounds. It was a good thing we had those here. Mrs. Hiller had her own cranberry bog right here in Rotary Park, and that was a bog up until 1957. So, you know, Wilmington's not one, the farmers anyway, aren't one to let these things go. They like to hang on and sustain the money-producing crops. So we had the hops, we had the cranberries, and we had the apples. Something else unique sort of to Wilmington is the Farmers and Mechanics Club. That was established a little bit later, like 1874, and there were many of these throughout the community, but Wilmington's was renowned, and we had people coming in from surrounding towns to learn a lot from the farmers here. It was founded by Harrison Allen Sheldon, who was the son of Asa Sheldon, another big farming family, and he also served as the inspector of cattle and provisions in Wilmington, and he made a good sum of money doing that. These Farmers and Mechanics Club, this particular one, had an annual fair, and every year these local farmers converged, and they were educational in such that the farmers, they didn't compete, they came to learn from each other. So if somebody had a better farming process, they wanted their neighbors to know that. They were very generous in their sharing their information. But there were also exhibits: livestock, crops, crafts. There were furniture. There were, women's crafts. They had contests. They had ball games on the town common. I don't want you to lose track of where we are, so they pull the red side. And again, Mrs. Hiller was invited to be a guest speaker there. So she was involved in farming, cranberries. There were many other families that were established young here in Wilmington, and they remained very strong farming families throughout. And the statistic that I have for populations of Wilmington, I could have done this a lot. I didn't want to give a lot of statistics because I thought that would make the topic drier than it could be. But up until 1900, Wilmington had less than 1,000 people living here. Up until 1900. That's amazing. And yet, throughout the 19th century, we produced the most hops, a large number of cranberries. No other community did cranberries. We had the Baldwin apple. That's huge. And that's amazing. These were hard-working people. They took that charge from Woburn very, very seriously. And even in 1899, the Harrison Allen Sheldon, he put up this advertisement as the Inspector of Cattle and Provisions as to why Wilmington farms were desirable. And he claims that the transportation in Wilmington made markets more accessible and made things less expensive. Now remember, we had the Middlesex Canal being able to bring products to and from Boston and up to New Hampshire. We also had the railroad coming through here in the 1850s. He comments on the soil. It has great variety, and irrigation is less expensive than in adjoining towns. Still true today. Still true today. The rate of taxation is lower and continues to decrease. I don't know if that's still the case. And a multitude of crops can be raised. And he was right about that. He definitely was. You know, we had the apple, we had the hops, and we had the cranberries. And they didn't let go of these things. They used these things, they produced these things until there was no more market for them. You know, the market for hops, it died as quickly as it rose. But Wilmington milked it for all it was worth, and the same with the cranberries. I think that's pretty impressive. So even in 1899, I refer back to the grant that the original settlers used to inspire them to come here to Wilmington. In 1899, Mr. Sheldon is doing the same thing. He's encouraging agricultural pursuits, and he wants to induce settlers of like faith and courage. He wants them to establish homes here for themselves and children. He wants them to subdue the howling wilderness. I love that description. And to plant and uphold the principles of the heroic little colony. So with that, I leave you, and I'm going to turn you over to Carolyn Harris, who's going to introduce our first non-agricultural industry. So keep the focus.
When we started working on putting together early 19th century Wilmington in terms of an industry, obviously it was the Vaughn Cracker Factory that first came to mind. And I emailed Laz or Fred Nielsen up in Maine, and I asked if he was aware of the research that his father had done. And he quickly emailed me back and said, "What do you mean? You have the whole Bond collection here." So, unfortunately, when we went through the Bond collection, and Bond was fourth generation in a part of the Bond Cracker factory, there wasn't really a lot. There was a lot of genealogy and pictures, and we did find a few comments, but I think it's kind of a shame that he didn't really chronicle one of the major industries that developed in Wilmington in the early part of the 19th century. As Kathleen said, we were primarily an agricultural community. The census indicated that between 1800 and 1865, Wilmington grew from 797 inhabitants to 850. You know, very industrious inhabitants, obviously. At the same time, a new industry was introduced, and that was the Bond Cracker Baking Factory. It opened its doors in 1802 and was perhaps our biggest industry in the early part of the 19th century, ending its manufacturing here in 1864. Before we get into the Bond Cracker Company, but the question is, what is a cracker? You know, is it bread? Is it dessert? Is it biscuit? The Bond Cracker is a form of a biscuit, and there was a whole deal of research that a biscuit was derived from a French word meaning twice baked, because the Roman army would have their meal, and the bread at that meal was twice baked, etc. And in England, it developed into anything that was a small cake made of flour with sweetening or any kind of flavoring added was called a biscuit. However, in early America, they didn't see that these biscuits were produced. Instead, what was produced was a cracker. The first cracker being a crude production made of plain and unsweetened dough. They were described as usually crisp, use that usually, depending on how it came out of the bag, unflavored, biscuit grade of good. So a cracker is, classified as a type of a biscuit. The first cracker produced in the United States, so far as known, was a pilot or ship's bread, which was described as large, round, clumsy, crispy affair, which supplied the demand for merchant marine for an article of food that could be kept. Unlike bread would spoil, these crackers could be kept for a long period of time. As I did the research, all I could think of was hardtack, in terms of the description of the taste and so forth. Another variety originated here was called the cold water cracker and differed chiefly in its smaller size, its compact texture, and greater hardness. So that must have been the hardtack. For a long time, these two crackers were the only goods known in trade here in, I want to say Massachusetts, but here in America. Both were made of unleavened dough mixed and kneaded by hand. Each cracker was rolled out and shaped separately before being placed at one time in a long-handled sheet iron shovel, or what they called a peel, and then placed in the floor of an oval-shaped tile oven. It was not until the mid-19th century that they began to use fermented dough to manufacture crackers, and the fermented dough led to a greater variety of types of crackers that could be produced. So we're indeed talking about a cracker factory here in Wilmington. The Bond Cracker Factory in Wilmington was founded by Captain Joseph Bond. Bond was born in Gloucester in 1761. He served as a private in the Revolutionary War, and indications were he served in the Continental Army under command of General George Washington. Following his military service, he was apprenticed as a baker in Boston for 1 year, 1789. From 1799 to 1801, Captain Bond commanded the East Militia Company of Woburn. Moving to Wilmington in 1798, he established the Bond Cracker Baking Factory in 1802. Captain Joseph Bond's house, and you'll notice in the historic district as I go through, there are a lot of Bond homes. Captain Joseph Bond's home is at the corner of Wildwood and Middlesex Ave. It was the Congressional of the Congregational Church's parsonage. Captain Bond and his wife, Polly, had 3 sons, Alston, William, and Joseph Jr. All, there were 4 generations of Bonds associated with the Bond Cracker Factory. Joseph Jr.'s son, Thomas, Timothy, and Albert. Thomas's son, Arthur Thomas Bond, our favorite, because that's the Bond collection. And Albert's son, Albert Henry. From the recollections of the Honorable Levi Gould, who resided in Wilmington in the 19th century and later became the first mayor of Melrose, and this is directly from the Bond collection. He wrote, "How well I remember the old cracker bakery established by Captain Joseph Bond, his sons William and Joseph Jr., and his grandsons Albert, Thomas, and Timothy. Bond crackers were the most famous and celebrated of the times in America. Captain Joseph Bond," and I think this is very good, we have a description of him, "was a tall, lean, active, gray-haired old gentleman of intense personality and great business ability. What induced him to select Wilmington, a mere hamlet in those days," that's quite common, "in which to establish a business of such magnitude has always been an enigma to me. His cracker wagons penetrated Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts and brought him much wealth." The location itself of the Bond Cracker Factory, and I'm hoping that you come up and take a look, but I'm going to bring this to you a little closer because we are standing at the site of the Bond Cracker Factory. If you look at this picture, off of the picture would be more buildings, and down here would be the cemetery. And right up through this last building would probably be sitting in the high school tennis courts right now. So it ran right along this side of Middlesex Ave. This home is the Albert Bond home, which today is the Bond Skelton McMahon home that was moved from this site across the street. So that just geographically locates where this huge factory was in relation to where we're standing and sitting this evening. Captain Joseph Bond passed the ownership of the factory to his son Joseph Jr., keeping in mind that he remained as the overseer. So although he passes it to his son, he doesn't really entrust his son to run the operation. Dad is right there every step of the way, making sure that things are done as he wished them to be. This is 1840, population's growing a little. We have new means of transportation, new roads are being built, the business is expanding. There is a demand for the Bond crackers. Joseph Jr. is generally credited with the continued success of the company after his father's death in 1840. He introduced new baking machinery and expanded his teams of bright red wagons. And I guess the description of the Bond cracker factory wagons were that you could see them coming a mile away because they were so bright and colorful. The ownership was passed on from Joseph Jr. to Thomas Bond and Albert Bond. In 1850, the federal census listed the two Bond cracker factories. One was owned by Thomas Bond and the other by Albert, each with 9 employees. Now, when you say the two, it's all one complex, but the baking company itself, where the actual baking was done, was you had 2 parts, 2 brothers working together. What should be noted in 1850 is many of these bakers that came to live and work here were Irish immigrants who came to America to escape the Great Potato Famine. One such individual is Daniel Kelly, whose son, James E. Kelly, was a former Wilmington town clerk for many years. Many of the workers boarded at the Blanchard House next to the Congregational Church, which was at that time operated by a family named Marshall. It appeared that the Bond cracker factory employed many on a part-time basis. In Asa Sheldon's book, The Life of Asa Sheldon, Wilmington farmer, 1862, he related the story of how Captain Joseph Bond's sons, Joseph and William, were at a loss of how to procure faggots which were used exclusively for oven heating to increase their production. Faggots in the early 19th century was a term applied to kindling wood. Quoting from the book, and I think this says a lot about Asa Sheldon, the farmer, as well as the businessman. Quoting Asa Sheldon, "I told them there would be no trouble if they would pay enough for them. It is such mean business, nobody will make them," as they said. "It will not be a mean business if you will pay a fair price for them. Who will make them if we will pay well for it? I will," said I. And by making it, it would mean simply going out into the forest, into the swamps, gathering the kindling, breaking it down, and bundling it so that it could be used for the ovens. "I should laugh to see you making faggots," said the brothers. "I should laugh to see you paying me for the money for it," said I. That says something big. The bargain was concluded between us that I should make all I could in 5 days, anywhere in Wilmington where they could go with a team, and they would draw them and pay 1.5 cents per bundle. At work I went, and in 5 days made 1,000 bundles, for which they paid me $15. In less than a fortnight after, many respectable citizens, together with the minister, his 2 sons, and the deacon employed themselves in making faggots for the bonds. And from that day to this, it has never been considered mean business. Many a laboring man has earned a few dollars who could not get it in any other way. Besides the benefit arising from the faggots themselves, it has been the cause of clearing many acres of swamp or lowland, which proves the best land for cultivation we have in Wilmington. So the cracker factory helped the farmers by clearing the land, as well as citizens by earning a few extra cents to put in their coffers. In the 1860 census, 2 Bond cracker factories were owned by Timothy Bond and by Albert Bond. Thomas was no longer listed as a baker, and we've had considerable conversations about what happened to Thomas, and we sort of feel that he retired, built what is today the rectory of St. Thomas of Villanova, and lived happily ever after. He was not considered from this point on a baker, but his twin brother was, Timothy, and Timothy will remain in the baking business right through 1877. Timothy is listed as having 10 employees, and Albert was listed as having 16 employees. The Bond Cracker Factory was the only serious employer in Wilmington that year. The rest, of course, being farmers and our smaller businesses, such as people involved in trade, blacksmith, and so forth. The Bond Cracker Factories, or rather, Timothy is generally credited with continuing the introduction of new machinery and the production of new biscuits and crackers. Until about 1840, machinery in the biscuit cracker business was almost unknown. But as the demand increased, a machine was finally invented which rolled out the dough, already prepared by hand, into thin sheet. The sheet passed along an endless belt or apron and was cut into the required shape by a stamp rising and falling automatically. So we're getting into this whole industrial age, just the beginning of it here. In this way, about a dozen crackers were cut at a time, and it became possible to bake 5 to 6 barrels of flour a day, which was an improvement over the previous 1 barrel of flour being baked a day. So you went from 5 or 6. It was an amazing revolution in the baking industry. And what it meant was they needed more wagons. They could distribute their goods farther and make an increased profit. By 1849, the discovery of gold in California became a real boom to the cracker industry. There was the demand for crackers as a pioneer food because it didn't spoil. You know, you could bring a barrel of crackers with you and on the Oregon Trail or wherever you were heading. In 1850, a machine business opened in Boston called the Deneo and Roberts bakery machine. It was located on Causeway Street, and it was the first to really build a machine for cutting crackers and biscuits, which again now is going to revolutionize the production. By 1857, the Bond Cracker Factory produced $220,000 worth of crackers. That's a very, very big sum for the year 1857. These were very wealthy people. By 1863, the Bond Cracker Factory advertised the following types of crackers: the Boston cracker, the butter cracker, the wine cracker, the water cracker, the milk cracker, the cream cracker, the lemon cracker, the picnic cracker, the president cracker, the pilot cracker, the soda cracker, the oyster cracker, the graham cracker, the ginger cracker, and the navy cracker. So we have really extended our production from the original just plain cracker that probably hardtack. The Bond Cracker Factory had just a distribution center in Boston and at 12 Canal Street. Of particular popularity was the Bond Butter Cracker. These crackers were used extensively by the United States government during the Civil War. And no doubt that certainly having a government contract during the Civil War added to the wealth of the bonds. In 1865, the Bond Cracker Factory won a silver medal at the Farmers and Mechanics Fair, somewhere in Massachusetts. It wasn't in Wilmington because ours wasn't founded until 1874. And we don't know exactly where it was, but we do know that in advertisements, this was considered a real big deal, and it was part of their advertisement from that point on, that they were a silver medal winner. However, the Bond factory was no longer operating in Wilmington. In February of 1864, the bakery, owned by Timothy Bond, caught fire. As recorded, the fire spread rapidly in the dry timbers, consuming some 500 barrels of flour and large amounts of crackers. Wilmington's people could only stand by and watch. The fire was seen from as far away as North Woburn, and one piece of apparatus, engine number 2 from North Woburn, was sent to the scene. But before the fire could be stopped, a spark from the fire blew across the street and lodged in the steeple of the Congregational Church. Before the eyes of Wilmington citizens, that fire spread and worked its way down the roof. No hose would reach it, and the daring men who tried to climb up could do nothing. The church, too, burned down, but not before many of its contents were saved. Thus really ended the Bond Cracker Factory here in Wilmington. However, the Bonds had a distribution center at 12 Canal Street in Boston, and it appears they moved their operation, or part of their operation, over a period from 1864 through 1865. By 1866, Albert is no longer a part or a recorded member of this move to Boston, but Timothy Bond had become the treasurer of a new company called the Boston Wheat and Bread Company, which was a wholesale shipping manufacturer of the so-called improved aerated bread and crackers. The advertisement read, "Under the personal supervision of T.D. Bond, Treasurer." Bond, particularly Timothy Bond, had an incredible reputation in the cracker industry. This new company, the Boston Wheat and Bread Company, grew very rapidly. There were 2 addresses given, one at 12 Canal Street in Boston, and if you had any question regarding their cracker production, you would address your concerns to 12 Canal Street. But another was the bread business that was located at 1010 Washington Street. This aerated bread used Dr. Garlish's system of manufacturing, which prevented the sudden expansion of dough to secure a perfect uniformity of the break, which immensely improved the texture, flavor, and appearance of the bread. The top half of the loaf was smooth and the crust thin. So he goes into not only crackers but bread making, and this was the newest type or system of bread making. The goal of this new company was to manufacture 30,000 loaves of bread and 100 barrels of crackers daily. That gives you kind of an idea of the size of this operation. The bread would be delivered to consumers through grocers, chiefly, but it was noted that not all grocers sold bread. The company proposed to deliver bread daily, wholesale to grocers, independent bread stores, hospitals, public institutions, hotels, boarding houses, and restaurants in the Boston area. The manufactory was on the corner of Washington and Concord Streets, with branch stores at 12 Merrimack Street and Haymarket Square. The branch stores would offer wholesale crackers of all kinds in any quantity for shipping, or otherwise at the lowest cash price. Timothy Bond himself wrote in Boston on January 12, 1866, "My familiarity with your manufacture of Dr. Dollish's improved aerated bread and my desire to see the system generally adopted in the United States incline me to give the expression of my opinion that no system of bread making can be more neat, simple, economical, or helpful. So soon as its advantages are known in our cities and large towns will be taken up eagerly, for I believe this is the bread of the people." Timothy Bond and the Boston Wheat Bread Company were both listed in the Boston Directory for bakers and crackers for the last time in 1873. There was a listing for Bond, Blanchard, Worthing and Company at 12 Canal Street with crackers, bakers as a line of business. One of the principals listed was Arthur T. Bond, our own Arthur T. Bond, who not only was a principal in this company, but had his own Bond advertising agency that he had established in Boston as well. The last listing of this company was in 1877. So what happened to it? We really don't know. According to some research that Captain Lars Nielsen did, the Bond Cracker Factory, which later became the Boston Wheat and Bread Company, became the Continental Baking Company, which was in operation as late as the 1960s, although there's no indication that the Wilmington Bonds participated in the Continental Baking Company. What about Bond bread? We've had great discussions about Bond bread because we feel that this is an area that really needs to have extensive research done because the Bond name was so closely allied with the cracker and bread business that there must be a relative somewhere in some closet that has something to do with the Bond bread company, which was particularly throughout New England in the 50s and early 60s. But that obviously will be a story for another day. The Bond Cracker Company was certainly our first major industry in Wilmington, and one only has to walk through the historic district and see the name Bond again and again to realize the contribution that they made to our community and to the state of Massachusetts and to the nation as a whole. With that said, we're going to move on to the late 19th century and some of the other major industries that will grow here in Wilmington. I'd like to introduce Terry McDermott.
Thank you. Carolyn and Kathleen were so interesting, I almost forgot what I had to say. But move on here. My main topic tonight is the tannery, but because the subjects seemed related, I thought I would speak a bit about slaughterhouses and livestock in Wilmington as well. In early Wilmington, most farms provided their own food and clothing, as we've seen, but most farmers also had a trade which they practiced when not farming. Communities set up informal systems of bartering, job sharing, and job trading in those days, and chances are that almost all farmers raised some livestock, and a few of the local citizens who specialized in slaughtering animals did so for all. In the Massachusetts State Census of 1855, 27 Wilmington people called themselves butchers. This does not mean there were 27 slaughterhouses in town. Most often, if the head of the household called himself a butcher, any sons over the age of 15 who lived with him called themselves butchers also. By the time of the 1860 federal census, 12 slaughterhouses operated in Wilmington. Town records indicate there were 6 slaughterhouses in town in 1870, but 9 operated by 1880, and a late 19th century article about the town claims that 11 slaughterhouses operated in 1885, with many cattle slaughtered here for the city markets. Yet by 1916, only 1 licensed slaughterhouse remained in the town, according to the town report, and it closed in April of that year. Farmers were still raising livestock in town, but they had to go further afield to find a professional slaughtering service. For a while, the town poor farm offered slaughtering services to paying customers. Other slaughterhouses appear occasionally in the town reports after this, but not in the numbers of the late 19th century. What remains of Wilmington slaughterhouses and the livestock industry in general are mostly faded memories and relics. I'm told there are a couple of butcher wheels, or windlasses, if I'm saying that right, in town, that were used for suspending and draining the slaughtered animals, which isn't a very pleasant thought, but other people, I haven't seen any, but people tell me they're around town, barns and things. I've heard stories about horse-drawn butcher wagons driving the streets of Wilmington peddling their fresh meat. Many people have told me that cows were everywhere in Wilmington as late as the 1960s. Unfortunately, knowing these facts about Wilmington livestock industry really provided me with no insight into the founding of our tannery in the late 19th century. It's unlikely that the tannery, which as far as anyone knows, always processed cowhides, relied upon local butchers to provide them with these hides. By the late 19th century, most tanneries did not want to rely upon local sources of hides. It was too uncertain and probably could not provide enough material consistently to keep a factory going. Most of what the tannery needed probably arrived by train, although it's possible that in the early years they supplemented this with hides from local farmers. What did local farmers do with their animal hides, especially before the tannery arrived? There's no documentation of exactly what they did, but we have enough information to speculate a bit. Lemuel Ames, a prominent citizen of Wilmington in the 19th century, wrote a brief history of Wilmington published in 1880. In it, he makes a vague reference to the early times when a, quote, tan yard was established in the north part of town, where the farmers were accustomed to take the skins of their slaughtered animals to be converted into leather for their own use, unquote. He goes on to say that the farmers used this leather to make or have made shoes for themselves, and a lot of Wilmington citizens considered themselves shoemakers in the middle of the 19th century. They were making their own leather. This tan yard must have been a well-used facility. It does not sound like a factory, simply a communal tanning area for use of the citizens. There's no evidence that there was any connection between this tan yard and the tannery that was eventually built in Wilmington. In the state census of 1855, 7 men with different surnames and operating out of one building called themselves patent leather finishers. If this was a business enterprise, we know nothing about it except that it and the men listed had disappeared from town by the time of the 1865 census. So what exactly is a tannery anyway? If it is defined as a place where tanning is done, what is tanning? Tanning is the process in which the skin of slaughtered animals is turned into leather. The process dates back hundreds of years and remained essentially unchanged until the early 20th century. The arrival of labor-saving equipment in the late 19th century allowed tanneries to process more hides faster, but it remained hard work, dirty, smelly, backbreaking. Hides, which were very heavy, needed to be cleaned, de-haired in the beam house, soaked in various solutions, including the tanning solution, then oiled and rinsed before any other finishing work was done. In the 19th century, the tanning solutions were prepared from the bark of trees rich in tannic acid. This was called vegetable tanning. It took months to produce a piece of leather using these methods. Early in the 20th century, the bark method was replaced with mineral tanning or chemical tanning, which greatly reduced the amount of time the hides needed to soak in the tanning solution. By the 1950s, a finished piece of leather could be produced in 3 weeks. Because of the availability of animal hides and tree bark and the never-ending need for good shoes, Massachusetts became very early on riddled with tanneries. In the 19th century, it seems that almost every town in Middlesex County was involved with shoemaking to some degree. Either leather tanning, household shoemaking, and later shoe factories and supporting industries thrived. In Woburn alone, 21 tanneries operated, employing over 500 people by 1865. It was almost inevitable that Wilmington, with its ready access to railroads, would get into the leather business eventually. So, on July 18, 1871, Sylvester Carter, a resident of town who called himself a farmer and who owned about 154 acres of land in Wilmington, according to the federal census of 1870, sold land along the train tracks in North Wilmington to Franklin W. Perry. It was probably about 10 acres, and the Wilmington Crusader reported in 1953 that it cost Mr. Perry $100 to acquire the land. The first contemporary reference I found to the tannery appeared in the Woburn Advertiser on September 8, 1871. Under the headline, Wilmington Business Enterprise, and by the way, there were no Wilmington newspapers that I could find, so you had to go all over the place looking for different towns to see if they were going to be talking about Wilmington, if you wanted to know what was happening here. Anyway, a very brief article reads, in part, the Messrs. Perry Cutler and Company, shoe and leather dealers, 28 High Street, Boston, have purchased a lot of land near the Boston and Maine Railroad Depot in this town and have erected thereon a 2-story building for tanning and currying operations. Manufacturing operations will commence about the first of the coming month. This is the first enterprise of the kind ever undertaken in this ancient and quiet town, and it's a precursor, it is presumable, of other and still greater operations. Oh, that 19th century flowery writing. A few months later, on January 26, 1872, the same newspaper ran the following. The new tannery of Perry, Cutler and Company now employs from 25 to 30 hands and is turning out about 300 sides of buff leather and splits per week. And by the way, a newspaper in Woburn, the readers would have known what they were talking about. There's constantly news in those papers about what was going on in the millions of tanneries that got there. They intend making additions in the spring and increasing the number of hands. We don't know a lot about the people who began this new tannery in Wilmington. Franklin W. Perry of Winchester and Sylvester P. Cutler of Woburn, in business as Perry, Cutler and Company, were the principals of a leather dealership located at various addresses in Boston throughout the 1870s. It's unclear whether they dealt with leather from sources other than the Wilmington tannery. From the town assessor records, we see that the tannery first consisted of one currier shop, one barn, and one hide house, and stood on about 10 acres of land. And I was going to note that the word curry and currier are often used to describe the final steps in the leather-making process in the 18th and 19th centuries. But by the end of the 19th century, the word had really fallen into general disuse. The tannery in Wilmington stopped using the term in their property assessment, as tanning came to describe the entire leather-making process. But if you read historical documents about tanning, the word curry usually comes up, or currier. The tannery quickly grew beyond the original 3 buildings. By its second year, a shed had been added to the barn, and another acre of property with 4 dwelling houses had been purchased. These 4 houses were probably always housing for employees, and the acre parcel they stood on is probably a piece of property that the tannery continued to own up until the 1950s. This property was not adjacent to the tannery, but up the street going toward town, a little beyond the intersection of Middlesex Avenue and Federal Street. People who remember them as they were in the 40s and 50s tell me that 4 small homes were always painted tannery red, the same color as the tannery, and people refer to the group of them as the Little Acre. First built and acquired in 1873, these homes were sold by Caleb Harriman in 1952, a few months before his death. In 18